Hello everybody, today we're going to be discussing Doctor Who Season 6. This is Patrick Troughton's third and final season as the Doctor, and we get to know a lot more about Zoe than we did in Season 5, as she gets to go on adventures and travel with the TARDIS duo that she was introduced to in The Wheel in Space, so it is interesting to have just a different flavor to the previous season of the show, as Victoria is replaced with Zoe, thus giving us an interesting look at what the dynamic of these different characters looks like. And just like Season 5, I really do enjoy Jamie and the Doctor. They are excellent together with some truly fantastic moments. The dynamic of them bouncing off one another makes some of the stories that probably shouldn't be as entertaining at least relatively fun to watch, though that is not always the case. So as with seasons 4 and 5, these characters are just great. And in these reviews, I haven't talked a ton about the character of Zoe, and I do have some stuff to say, but I do have to say there's gonna be some mild spoilers in this review. I won't be getting into anything huge in terms of plot specifics, but I will be going over some broad strokes insofar as where the season went, the different kinds of stories we had told, what I thought about them, as well as the characters and their journey throughout the season. So there's your loose sort of spoiler warning, nothing too heavy, but take it as you will. And with Zoe, I did really like her on paper. I appreciate how she is quite a smart companion, and she does seem to have more fun than Victoria did in season 5, whereas Victoria had more of an arc where she learned that traveling in the TARDIS was not where she was meant to be in her life, and before you know it, she had chosen to leave. That's a perfectly fine way to handle a character, but for me, I probably would have appreciated it if she had a little bit more fun while in the TARDIS, which is not a criticism of what they did, it's just to say that if Victoria had as much fun as Zoe seems to have had, I probably would have appreciated season 5 just that little bit more. Again, that's not intended as a specific criticism, it's just an observation about the kinds of characters I enjoy watching in Doctor Who. And here we have quite a smart person from the future who is having more fun in lots of ways, and that, on paper, works for me. And at times, Zoe is really good, but unfortunately, there are points at which the character just isn't all that well performed, and I really don't mean to criticize Wendy Padbury too heavily, and I do hate to say this, but there are times when Zoe is a little bit over the top and just wasn't quite connecting with me. And that's such a shame because this character should have really worked, and there are elements to her that I really like here, but at the end of the day, I think I appreciated what they were going for more than I enjoyed watching it on screen. She didn't really take away from the TARDIS dynamic, and in places she absolutely added to it, but it was a shame that she wasn't more consistently adding to the show, and that the performance didn't always work for me. And looking at these stories that are being told, yeah, there's quite a bit of variety which I did legitimately appreciate. However, I must say that there were a number of weaker stories in here. Of the 7 that were told, I found that 3 of them just weren't that appealing, and the other 4 were varying degrees of good to great, but there were 3 in here that really did drag this down a bit, and this stands in sharp contrast to Season 5, which is an incredibly consistent season with 4 great stories, and 3 which are either pretty good or rather average. But in this one, the best elements of the season with stories like the War Games, which I love, and interestingly, is actually a quarter of this entire season, those are dragged down by the ones that don't work, in stories like the Space Pirates, the Crotons, and the Dominators, which are just varying levels of bad to average. And that just adds up to all of these stories, leaving a good portion of this season to drag down the rest of what could have been a really great one. And that is genuinely a shame to me that Patrick Troughton's final season goes out on a little bit of a weaker note than either of his previous 2, and this was also the case for Hartnell a little bit if you call season 3 his final one, which is mostly true, but not entirely. But it isn't such a bad thing on the whole, because what you really have is a quarter of it dedicated to his final story, and yes, it didn't really need to be 10 parts, but they did a really good job of introducing new elements throughout that story and keeping me, as an audience member, engaged for the entirety of its run, and giving Troughton just a phenomenal send-off in this final story of his era, which was just brilliant. And that serial, as said, was 1/4 of the entire season, so it is a large part of it, and my opinion on that one single story does sway my overall opinion on the season by a notable amount. If I didn't like the War Games, then this season really wouldn't be getting a good grade because it is such a huge story just in terms of size, but also in terms of its relation to the Second Doctor, as it is his final story from the 1960s. You can start off a season weak, but it is super important to end strong so as to give Patrick Troughton the send-off he deserves. And that is something I think they did really well with Hartnell. And this is a place where I do see a bit of a parallel between the Hartnell and Troughton eras of the show, where their first 2 seasons were quite strong, but then their final season was a little bit more mixed and weaker on the whole. And Hartnell had more good stories in his 3rd season, and this one was just a little bit more varied in terms of the quality of its stories. I mean, you jump right from the Space Pirates to the War Games, one of the Second Doctor's all-time worst stories followed immediately by one of his best, and both of these Doctors had a great final story. At the beginning of Season 4, the 10th Planet was great, and at the end of Season 6, the War Games was fantastic. And that is the most important thing, because the season can be incredibly mixed throughout the first 6 stories, but if you can manage to nail the ending to this era of the show and deliver a satisfying conclusion to a Doctor, I'm going to feel very satisfied and rewarded as a fan. Whereas if the ending is messed up, it's going to be much more disappointing than just a random story not being enjoyable, because it is the final note you are left with for an era. And fortunately, both of these eras succeeded in delivering excellent conclusions. The War Games was fantastic, and I could sing its praises for ages, but if you want to see me do that, then you can just watch my review. And again, about the variety of this season, you have a lot of that in here throughout these really different and unique kinds of stories, with the invasion serving as what I think is quite a solid, for the most part, Cyberman invasion serial that works really well despite being just a little bit too long for its own good, and the Mind Robber being a really fun and interesting different type of story which feels like an incredibly unique serial in Patrick Troughton's run as the Doctor. I also found myself really enjoying The Seeds of Death, which is a story I started off enjoying a little bit less than The Ice Warriors, but came out of it appreciating it just as much, if not more, than the first Ice Warriors story. Without giving you any specifics on the companion exits this season, they're absolutely fantastic. Really, truly great exits to companions. I was surprised to see how brilliantly they were pulled off. And in terms of the Doctor's Regeneration, the second time such a thing has ever been attempted in this show, what's interesting is how he regenerates without much of a visual representation. There is something resembling that, but it is notably different to what we see with the first Doctor in the 10th Planet. The exit itself is quite good though. We see him forced to leave this body, which was a bit sad to see, even if it wasn't as emotional as with the companions for me, because the story didn't seem to give it quite as much emphasis. It was just a shame to see such a great actor leave the role of the Doctor, because Patrick Troughton has been fantastic in this show. I'm actually quite interested in the different takes on Doctor's regenerations, because different writers are going to tackle it in different ways, and here it seems pretty clear that the show has been at least somewhat planned out in order to have a regeneration. So it's quite different to William Hartnell's incarnation just wearing a bit thin, as this time we see the consequences of the Doctor's actions that will affect the immediate future of the show. So this one does work really well, and I'm glad that it was able to be worked neatly into the narrative as well as it was. And while it's true that this season was definitely a disappointment in some ways, with an extremely varied level of quality across the different stories, I still found it to be a satisfying conclusion for the Doctor, because we do get such a great story to close out on, which was the thing that mattered the most to me about this season. Overall, I found this to be a pretty enjoyable season, with some elements that were absolutely fantastic, as well as some that really weren't. This was definitely mixed on the whole, but was still a pretty satisfying conclusion altogether, and I do like our main characters, particularly Jamie and the Doctor, and I love the ending that we get with both of the companions and our main character. The final story also really makes up for what was, up to that point, a rather mixed season of the show. It was a fantastic end to not only this Doctor and his companions, but also this era of Doctor Who on the whole. There was definitely a lot to enjoy in this, and even though it wasn't as good as either of Troughton's first 2 seasons, I found this one to be a pretty good one, and I am going to give Doctor Who Season 6 a rating of 7 out of 10. And that does it for today, everybody. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on this season down below if you feel like doing so. And though this review has come to a close, I have 2 more 60s Doctor Who videos to come before we get started in reviewing the 3rd Doctor's era, so I hope you will consider joining me for my ranking of this season's stories, or for my top 10 second Doctor stories, whatever you feel like checking out. And if you don't come back, then that is absolutely fine, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, thank you very much for watching, take care, and have a lovely week.